Hi, this is Harriet Grayson, your host and producer for Community Culture Showcase. And believe me, it feels like summer out there. It is hot, 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 but it's cool, cool, cool in the studio. And I have a cool, cool guy for you to meet today. As many of you might know, I run these literary salons. We opened up August 1st at the Tapped Apple Literary Salon, Poets Corner. So I have the great pleasure of presenting one of my poets who came, and also I've met him he's come to another literary salon event. So without further ado, the cool, cool guy, James Nicola.
Thank you, Harriet. So happy to be here.
So tell us, poets, we think of poets, glassy-eyed people just wandering around, writing down their thoughts. What's a modern poet really like?
Everyone's different. That's the interesting thing. There's no typical story, I don't think, of a poet anymore. And people come to it at different times of their life and for different reasons. So I actually have an article coming out next year of advice for people entering poetry. And I think I say whether you're 25, 55, or 85, there's a path for you, and it might not be the way anyone else is doing it. So people are starting poetry in their 50s, their 80s, as well as their 20s or teens or as little kids.
We go through phases always in literature. This is true for art and culture in general. We have a high point, we have a low point. Do you think of this current time as being a rising interest in poetry?
Oh, poetry is huge at the moment, or what we're calling poetry, or sometimes it's performance poetry in other cultures. But there's a lot of people involved in poetry at the moment. However, there's so much different poetry, and there's so much what one might not used to call poetry, etc. So it's an interesting time where it's one of those anything postmodern, as it were, era where we can't really see what it is till we get to the next and look back. But it's one of those anything goes times.
And most of the stuff that I do is headquartered in Westerly, Rhode Island, which has become like a little hotbed of culture. Hopefully, I'm helping to promote that and to get it really going from a simmer to maybe a broad fire, to get people to come to Westerly, not only for the drinking in the restaurants, but for a little culture.
Why not?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So I'm always interested. I am not a poet. You know that I write novels, so I'm a novelist, and I tend to write mysteries, so that's my little field of endeavor. But I've always liked poetry, and our August 1st, when we had our first Poets Corner, one of my jobs as the organizer was, since I'm not a poet and I didn't do any reading of my poetry, I read poetry that I thought might be inspiring, kind of get the audience kind of listening and maybe more involved. So I read from the Book of Psalms,
right,
and then I read from Milton's Paradise Lost, and then I read Shakespeare's sonnets, and ended up with E.E. Cummings. And one of the things most interesting for me, of course, E. Cummings broke all the rules when it came to written words in terms of his whole style, no punctuation. But there was a reason for what he did. So it isn't like he just made this stuff up and decided to do it. But that was kind of controversial, I'm sure, in its day.
Yeah, some called it, I think Gertrude Stein might have called his work, particularly when he got wacky with capitalization, punctuation, line endings, space between parentheses or not or whatnot, Cubist poetry. They made it analogous to what the Cubists were doing on a canvas. That is, the normal grammatical syntax was not all there is, and yet he used grammatical syntax. He used sentence structure, and you looked at his sonnets, I know. His sonnets are straight sonnets, straight Shakespearean sonnets, except the couplet at the end is rhymed like Shakespeare, but the others he generally does slant rhyme, not real rhyme, in the quatrains. But nonetheless, they're stunning. They're stunning, and just normal everyday sentences, but with all lowercase and semicolons without a space after them and whatnot. But structurally, it's oh my gosh, it's really exciting. Some of his sonnets are my favorite.
So
poems
September
ever.
5th is going to be my next Literary Salon Poets Corner at the Tapped Apple
Right.
in downtown Westerly. So tell me what you would recommend. I like to go through the history. So I'm thinking of the Greeks.
Oh, of other poets to read?
So I'm thinking of the Greeks. I want to start at least that far.
The
And
Greeks.
The Greeks. And then I was thinking
Well,
Christopher.
the Greeks are not known for their short poetic forms. They're known for their epic poetic forms.
I'm only
an
gonna read
excerpt, like the opening of the Iliad, you can't go wrong with, and look at 3 or 4 translations and mention, because that first line is
Sets
to the
the stage,
gods.
yes.
Well, it's also what the verb is in the very opening of the Iliad is interesting, or some of the Aeneid or whatnot, or some Terence or something from a play. But there are of Sappho, who was the actual poet as opposed to playwright, who was actually earlier than classical. There are only fragments of her stuff yet, and yet it's very passionate, apparently, in translation.
See,
it's
that's
hard
why
to go
I
back
like
to
to
the
have you as my
Yeah,
come
it's
to
hard
my
to go back
poetry.
to the Greeks and have something excerptable for an olio
an
of an
audience?
evening. Well, for an olio of an evening where you're doing a lot of stuff. The Greeks had a high attention span, not much else going on in their life. So they had such great long. But an excerpt, a compelling excerpt from one of the great Greek plays is in verse. All the Greek play, and also the interesting thing about the classical Greek and the Greek era is they didn't differentiate between poetry, plays, or dance. They were all danced, and hence Aristotle's book, The Poetics, is about playwriting. Same thing. The playwright was a poet, and the poet was the director, and they didn't have papyrus, so he had to narrate the line. So he knew him really well. But
That's
anyway.
why I asked
So
you,
it's tough
because
to
no,
find
I
a Greek
asked you
excerpt,
for
yeah.
your advice, because just by listening to you,
Yeah.
people can learn.
Right.
a
If you're going to go
lot.
card cataloging in the library, don't look up Greek and poet. Look up Greek and plays, and they're the poets.
There's the poets.
Right.
Very good. And then I was thinking of Christopher Marlowe, a
Yeah.
contemporary of Shakespeare, maybe even someone who wrote what we could credit to Shakespeare. Lots of always controversy.
There's no controversy.
No controversy?
There's no
Shakespeare
controversy.
wrote it all.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what do you
And Marlowe
think?
died in '91, so he was dead for most of Shakespeare's career.
So 19th century, who should I read?
Dickinson is the God on earth.
Okay. And then the 20th century. The 21st century is my poets who come to read, so I can't. So
Well,
the 20th century.
Unless there's some of the turns you want a lot. As I read some Warren the other day, as you know.
Yes.
The other one that's unsung from Amherst, Mass, just up the road, the other Amherst poet, besides Emily Dickinson, is Robert Francis, the most
Okay.
underrated poet of the 20th century. That should be a household name. So
All
look
right.
at Robert Francis.
All right, Robert Francis.
And then the other great one is, you ever heard of Franny and Zoe?
Mm-hmm.
In real life, Franny and Zoe were brother and sister that lived in the same house as J.D. Salinger apartment growing up in New York, and that would be Howard Nemeroff and Dion Arbus were brother and sister, and they were the inspiration for Franny and Zoe, the Whiz Kids. So I recommend some Howard Nemeroff, very readable, can't go wrong.
So why don't you, since you have the master of all of these, why don't you give us a selection of one of your books of poetry? You are the author of four books of poetry.
And actually, as a little segue, my first book is actually not poetry, it's playing the audience. So just as the Greeks had no distinction between poetry and playwriting, I came to the arts through the theater and music. I have a degree in music. And so my first book is called Playing the Audience, The Practical Actor's Guide to Live Performance. And Playing the Audience is a nonfiction book. And just to put an umbrella on the whole evening, the first line of it starts like this. For young actors or beginning in their career, or directors or playwrights, the theater is a lot like humanity. It needs your help. And everything else about playing the audience is about what you're doing is not merely expressing or hiccuping or burping or emoting or feeling and sharing your feelings. You're actually trying to evoke something that can rock the world perhaps, or invite taking a different look at things. And so here is one that's...
Where is it from?
This is from my first poetry collection book, which is called Manhattan Plaza.
Okay.
Manhattan Plaza is about New York City as well as my apartment. And this particular poem, called 1985, got a bit of traction on Twitter or something. Novelists found it and loved it, and people have been talking to each other about this particular sonnet. It's actually a 14-line poem
good.
in a sonnet, but not a Shakespearean sonnet, because it doesn't have a
couplet at the end.
It does, but the couplet is separated by a stanza break. So it's not 4, 4, 4, 2. It's 6, 7, and 1. But that doesn't matter. It's still a sonnet. But it's just a slightly modern. It's called 1985. The phone rang weakly in that early age of ringing out ammonia tears when the plague was new. Actors of too few and roles were lost. Too many ghosts of stage and film too quickly made. Now calls from lover, spouse, or sibling are rarer, but not over. Were you to phone today and tell me that you'd found my number starred beside my name in his black book, and thought that you should take the time to dial me up and tell me what he'd thought of me, that I was not the same as others he'd known, I'd ask, when's the wake? And tell you to be glad that you're alive. I might not have in 1985. And that's the poem.
So what inspired you to write this?
A few phone calls a week that friends were dying in 1985. Particularly a dear friend and an actor that I did a show up in Concord with was dead. People were not, I don't want to say falling like flies, but I was getting lots of phone calls from people that I didn't know but that were lovers of actors that I'd worked with. And just I was their name in the black book, and I got a call. It was pretty grueling, 1985, that transition. Right when Rock Hudson made his announcement, and all of a sudden the word was out. 1984 was virtually not talked about. 1985, it was surprising that Reagan didn't talk about it. Remember, we were all surprised that he didn't, couldn't say the word AIDS and whatnot. So this is all I have disclaimers in all my poetry books that nothing is autobiographical, but of course it all comes from experience.
Yes.
Fertilized by creativity. Yes. But this was particularly inspired by a dear friend, first to die terribly. Yeah.
Well, poetry, or any kind of form of literature, could be short story, could be novels, but poetry, I think, is easier to attack something like a momentous occasion. I mean, you could write a huge novel on it.
Yeah, momentous occasion that's actually called occasional poetry, like for a wedding, or a funeral, or a celebration, or after 9/11, our poet laureate at the time was Billy Collins, and he had an occasional poem that he read to Congress about
And it
Americans.
just seems the most appropriate way to signal and to cherish, perhaps, and keep forever this whole idea of this particular moment, this situation.
Right.
So that's what I always like poetry.
When you go look at some poems to read for all your salons, you'll see epithalamians or epithamalians, I forget for wedding poems, etc. And then elegies and whatnot. Those are all written for a particular purpose. And then there's most of Robert Frost's actually essay in the form of his long ones, essay, and he actually has what they call pastorals or pastorals, two shepherds talking philosophy. And that goes way back to 800,000 years, but I just read the novel Spartacus. You still have, or the dialogues of Plato, he'll just, instead of talk philosophy, he'll have two characters talking philosophy. And so in the Renaissance, it was having two lowbrow, uneducated characters talk philosophy, so that we'd look at it through the prism of nobly fine men of nature who are out there with their flocks or herds talking philosophy. It's very interesting. So that's another form or genre that emerged.
So are you a teacher of poetry? No?
No.
But you seem like you could be one who could give endless discussion.
Well, to anyone that doesn't know anything, yeah.
No.
People thought I was an expert in Shakespeare too, and I was directing a lot of plays. I just directed a lot of Shakespeare plays. Did a lot of research. Did a lot of to teach period styles in drama schools. Occasionally, I've been a visiting faculty, but never interested in a tenure track, long-term position in a drama school. I'm just not interested in that. I'm interested in always being excellent, and your last show having to be there and be most excellent, so you get your next from your last show, not from tenure. I always wanted to have to be on my toes, as it were. Not to say that faculty aren't, but I wanted to be in New York and always inspired by other people's work and pushed and whatnot, and have a whole bunch of friends and colleagues that can come to your rehearsal and give you notes. When you're in the middle of Missouri or Ohio, who do you call to give notes? You got to get somebody from Pittsburgh or Cleveland, and it's a big drive. It's not that it's impossible, and I did that too when I've done things out of town. Is who can I get to see the last final dress and give me notes and say this, etc. And so, but now, the biggest challenge is writing and making sure that this wonderful thing that I like to bring to my poetry is the thing that the actors fear that tries to make them excellent. Is you don't want to be Lousy. You don't want to. I can't say it. I don't use that word. And so we have that terrible thing. Therefore, the notion of writing anything, whether it's an article or a memoir or a poem or a song, sticking it in the drawer, looking at it again, and making sure it knocks the socks off, making sure that you burned to write it, and it burns the listener, reader, audience. And sometimes you realize, well, I was in love with that day, but it's not burning me today. But my friend said, when I wrote a lot of sonnets when I was writing daily, and my best friend got them, and she would say, a nice couplet, until I finally dawned, I got 12 other lines to worry about, making them better than draft one. So now I don't usually share draft one, because draft one's a draft.
You're right, right.
By the same token, I also, this moment, don't usually write draft one, and what used to be draft 1 and 2, I don't write anymore. I think about, not that, but I think a long time, and then
you put it on paper.
And then now my draft 1s are about what draft 3 used to be, but still draft 6 or 10 or 20 is often the course, because you keep looking at it. And a lot of poets, unfortunately, writing today, the interesting thing is they're not scared of, they want to express and feel and perform and get it out there, and that's great, but not all schools are about the crystallization or perfection or the concision of that you couldn't change a word and make it better. There's a lot of poets says, be better without that word, be better with that, be better without that stanza, be better without, etc. But you have to do that to yourself. No one does that for you or to you. But
would you think that if you did it publicly, if you read your stuff and can you not read the audience and see if they've picked up on something, or have people, just like you do with a play, to have someone listen and say, well, maybe.
But that depends on where you are as a performer. In other words, if you can read clearly, and if it's as rich and plush as Shakespeare, the ones I did last week on the first, I chose the first 2 big long ones, were hard poems, but I worked on them just like I work with actors on Shakespeare to try to bring the listener through all the things that were connected in the poem. And if you read the poem, that's in my third collection, Wind in the Cave, has some of those thick, complex, and not just narrative, they're about something somewhat esoteric, or they're a big metaphor, like I read the one about, so there you are at the cave, and there's the stone. And whoever the you is in the poem, you're either next to me or you're on the other side of the stone. And the stone either exists or it doesn't exist. Well, this is all philosophical metaphor for times of life where you have to do something to get through a hurdle, and you either do it with someone, or to reach someone, or to get away from someone. And I put all that into the Open Sesame poem, which is from the collection Wind in the Cave, which just came out in December. I'm not going to read it because it's a long poem here today.
Okay,
but for those that get the book Wind in the Cave,
there it is.
It's about the feeling of, okay, now we got to get through the mouth of a cave, and there's a stone in the way. And even the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves Open Sesame line was not just about coming to the cave, but in the story, about the cave of life. The cave, when you're inside or outside, you're at a new place, and you can never be the same. Once you go into a cave and go out again, you're never going to be the person that didn't go into the cave. You'll never be the person that was not inside that cave. You're changed forever. And so, but I realized, this is rich. But a few of my poet friends, one's a Rhode Island poet friend, said, do the hard stuff. When she was visiting in my apartment, and I read her a hard one, and she said, do that one when you. And I did, and I'm surprised that you do not, it takes some work to put all the thoughts, just like connecting things in a Shakespeare play, to make it as clear as stage life, which is what I wanted to do as a Shakespearean director, is make it clear on one listening. You know, when you read Shakespeare, you got to go, what? Or even Melville, Herman Melville, the thickest prose writer. It's fabulous, but there's chunks you got to read twice. Nothing wrong with that. But with Herman Melville, you read it twice, and you get it. With some, you got to read it 3 times to get it, and that's prose. And with poetry, Philip Levine from Michigan, just passed away a little while ago, he used to say, oh, I'm turned on when you got to read it 10 times to get it. The trick is, if it's all on the page, and Cummings is like that, Yeats is like that. Oh, Yeats is my other big favorite one, but particularly Second Coming. I think it's time to read Second Coming next month. That's a killer for 20th century. Yeah, we need to hear that one again. And I remember 15, 20 years ago starting to indulge in poetry as a daily pastime, reading Yeats's selections from an anthology, and then reading them again a few days later before I went to the next ones. So I had been and am a lyricist, but that kind of richness of text where, whoa, this many words is that much meaning. And I remember in the poem Second Coming thinking, is that what you're talking about? Oh my gosh. Then going to the top again for the 5th time, second day, and realizing that is what you're talking about. That Second Coming, that Sphinx, that Bethlehem. He's actually talking about the Second Coming, the end of the world, Armageddon, and the precursor to it is when the best are silent. I was using the Irish independence and World War I as a springboard for that, but the best cannot be silent. And what we have to have is the best actually not only loud, but articulate. We can't have the best babbling. We have the best people with good hearts, good consciousness, and basic goodwill toward men. We have a lot of the worst being loud right now. We have to have the best counteract them. They got to be pretty smart, though. Sacha Baron Cohen is not enough. We need more. My brother just read me all this stuff on what's he in the news for, and he just read me online all the things he's doing. I go, well, that's great. What fun. That's a gadfly. That's what we need. That's wonderful. So anyway, but that Yeats poem, it's for today, any time that it looks like the end, not because the number of an odometer is turning, like they had fears not unlike Y2K at the turn of the previous century. They had these fin de siècle, end of century, anxiety. But when it's actually because of deeds that people are doing, not because of the way the calendar's working, you've got to speak up. And so poetry can, to me, that is crystallized, essential, can't be changed, can't be improved, perfect, exhilarating on one read, even though it may take some homework for the poet to figure out how to deliver it, to convey not just the words, but the richness of image, thought, and connection between the synapses, the connection between thoughts and stanzas. It's almost like, and this is what I learned directing Shakespeare, you have to be able to diagram a sentence really well. So the removing of grammar from education in all public is, unfortunately, the removal of thought, thinking, reading, speaking, writing, all that has been removed from most Americans in public school because there's no grammar. And I'm reading this wonderful book called To Explain the World by Weinberger, who won a Nobel Prize in Physics. It's fabulous. And that the original for universities, the first 3 subjects, there were 7, but the first 3 were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The 3 things that have been virtually removed from public school in the last 26 years. So that's interesting. You need grammar, logic, clear thinking. This leads to that. This person who's making this argument on whatever TV station, that doesn't lead to that. They just jumped. This doesn't show that. And you see that all over the place. What are you saying that for? This is the case. Where'd you get there? Logic and rhetoric. How to speak well and inspire. So you can be a leader and not just a follower. But our education, unfortunately, is perfect STEM education, perfect for a dictatorship, right? To quote my Russian friends, oh my God, STEM? No arts, no humanities, no human being? Perfect educational system for a dictatorship. And this person was born in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But that's why poetry is there to fight that.
Yes.
It's crystallized thought. It's paying attention. Attention is the new currency. Attention is going to be the currency of the future. And that's why we call it paying attention. You have to give, and then you get, hopefully, a transformative experience, or possibly just one thought that you never had before.
Yes.
I mentioned in chatting that I heard this great line. When I see poetry readings, I'll write a line to just keep that line. Oh, that's wonderful, and it makes me listen closer. I can't always get the whole poem, but I realized if you don't do that, you're not going to get the whole poem anyway.
Right.
I love to find a poet and then go back and reread their poems the 3 times. It's hard to get the whole poem at a poetry reading on one time through. But I heard somebody say, once a mother, always once you're a mother, that's what you are. And I went, that's right. It wasn't anti-feminist, it wasn't post-feminist, but once you're a mother, that's what you are. As opposed to when you're a father, you're not just a father and it doesn't go with you. Mother, it changes you forever. You're a mother. And I think the line might have been, "Once your mother, that's all you are," in the context, but I forget what I have it written down. But once, it changes you forever, and you're always linked to that at least one birth out there. Whereas the dad can go, historically has been able to go elsewhere. I know. Isn't that interesting? Just very concise. I went, oh my gosh, that's something I'll never know. Although I do. Oops, I'm touching. So, but let me give you, since we put up Wind in the Cave, let me give, Wind in the Cave is a little bit, about the feelings in your gut after loss, or love unrequited, or sometimes addiction or alcoholism, or perhaps the moment when you said something horrible and didn't realize it and hurt somebody that you love, and things like that. So The Wind in the Cave is the title of that collection. And all these books are available if you just check out my website for how to find them, mostly on Amazon also, too, and from publishers or from me for a signed copy. But this is a fun one, sort of at the end of an affair, and toward the end of the book when we get humorous and triumphant. It's called Retort to an Outgoing Love. I'll jump in the lake, as you've requested, anything to satisfy. Has the water, though, been tested? If the water be infested, you, my dear, would be arrested should I deign to soothe your ache. Do what you say, jump in the lake and die. Give me another command, though, and I'm your servant, foolish and fervent, in love and sin, as I've always been, my dear, my hell, as you know only too well. And this is not me, but I've known people that have actually, what are you going back to that? You know what for? But anything they want them to do, they do.
Yes.
Even to death. They just, once you're in love, it's hard to fall out of love.
It's
even
true.
If you haven't seen the person in years. So anyway, that's one of the fun, humorous ones. It's not all anguish and
yes.
It's and,
a little variety.
Yeah,
yes.
Right, so
when you're putting a collection of poetry together, do you have a sense about which one is going to be the first, which one's going to be the last, and then what follows in?
It takes a lot of time, particularly once the collection has been accepted for publication in the order. So that Manhattan Plaza, the first book about New York, goes chapter in 5 or 6 parts. I can actually read them. Part 1 is the city. Part 2 is the people. Part 3 is the neighborhood. It's about the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood near Times Square. Part 4 is the buildings, and these are the buildings of Manhattan Plaza, which is my big complex. 5 is the residents, so it's other people in the buildings. And 6 is come in. So the poem I read in 1985, you're in my apartment and you know my friends. So it goes from big, broad New York City poems, Brooklyn included, and comes right to my home. So you're getting closer. The second collection I have is called Stage to Page, Poems from the Theater, and has such a stunning cover. It was nominated to be on an exhibit at the Louvre Museum because of the cover artist, who was the same as for Manhattan Plaza. And this has 3 parts to it, 1, 2, and 3, but Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And Act 1 has to do with actor training, or getting to the craft. Act 2 is mid-career and people living their lives in the theater, and Act 3 is death, or latent career, or there's some Our Town poems about Act 3 in Our Town. And Emily in Our Town was named for Emily Dickinson, just to bring it back, because Thornton Wilder, the author of Our Town, taught the Emily Dickinson lectures at Harvard and made her a household name because of it. So that's Stage to Page. Wind in the Cave, I have an order that starts with the epigraph, my desires are wind trapped in the cave, and things like that. And then at the end, it gets more triumphant, and it's a poet or a narrator toward the end of life putting it all together. And it ends with this lovely poem looking back on life and a life of loss, of love, called Weston. It's short enough. I'll do another Wind in the Cave poem to give you an idea of the journey. Weston. I turned left onto love, which runs half parallel to pine, with Highland, the connecting link on a morning walk of mine, and thought of those whom I have loved, and those for whom I'd pined. Then I thought, I've walked the highland, and I felt fine, because the light was low and cool, and sweetened so the day. And every road, including love, had taken me this way.
Very nice.
So it was putting together the whole life of, okay, not married, I've had loves, but thank you for them all. Thank you all for the loss and whatnot. And then the last book that just got published just last month, June, came out, called Out of Nothing, Poems of Art and Artists, is all poems about art, architecture, some dance, some music, some sculpture, some public spaces and piazzas and whatnot also. And there's pictures and illustrations of some artworks or some film clips or Leonard Bernstein conducting, because there's a Leonard Bernstein poem. And that, when I first submitted it, did not have a 1, 2, 3 order. It does have a 1, 2, 3 order now, but one, Out of Nothing is the title, and part 1 has the one coming, and there's a prologue at the top of the ... 1 at the top of the page. And then in section 2, it's ... 2 ... in the middle of a page.
Oh.
And then section 3 is 3 ... at the bottom right of a page. So it's going left to right, up to down. Something came before the nothing, and something comes after the nothing. So Out of Nothing. So the titles themselves, of the sections themselves, are trying to give you an idea of the shape of the book. And then we also are chronological, because the beginning starts not only about process of art, and I'll have to read you the first poem in the book of section 1. There's a prologue also, but it's short, and it gives you an idea of the beginning. And then ancient art and Renaissance. Part 2 is from the romantic 18th and 19th century to 20th century, and part 3 is contemporary art and leaving one's aftermath, and after death, what do we leave? So not too dissimilar to stage to page in that it parallels life. So, but it takes a lot of time to figure out the exact, and then the editor plays back and forth with me with suggestions. But at the beginning of Where Does Art Start? This is Out of Nothing, Poems of Art and Artists. Where does art start? What makes a dart? Dart. The hand, the head, the heart? Perhaps all art is from the part impossible to chart, except as art. And that's how the book starts. And then we go on.
Wow.
Yeah, and then there's some about Van Gogh, and some about Sheeler, and some about there's quite a bit of Monet and Renoir and things.
So
like
it's all paintings that you're
because I mentioned there's buildings, there's statues, there's some statues in Dublin. There's another one about the bridge. There's one about the Brooklyn Bridge with the Joseph Stella. I read that on the first, but there's another one called Bridge, which I almost do all the time, and it's about the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and it's about the notion of being awestruck by a bridge. And that one I think I know by heart. It's called Bridge from Out of Nothing, Poems of Art and Artists. And that too is a short one, so I can give you another dose.
Yes.
Bridge. I see supports at either end. The rest, though, is a riddle. Why doesn't it begin to bend or break in the middle? I see in diagrams that show with streams of numbered arrows where all its weight's supposed to go instead of down the narrows, but don't grasp engineering's quirks, and so feel overawed with skepticism that it works, suspicion of a god. And to me, still, that really is what keeps up an airplane or a bridge. I just don't believe it. And I've had the dynamics explained to me. I get it, but I go, it's still a miracle that those big bridges hold up. It's that those laws of physics obtain. That is enough proof to me of that there's something magical around, that we can do that. It's just incredible. And I don't think I've read you one at all from stage to page yet.
Right.
This is a cute one. Oh, I'll read you. You all know who Charlie Chaplin was, so some of it is a film and music and dance also. And this is a little bit of a longer one, but it's called a ballad form. You'll recognize it because Jabberwocky and Mary Had a Little Lamb are similar to ballad form. And Charlie Chaplin was the silent film star, the great comedian, more famous than the Pope in 1919. He was the number one biggest name in the world, 1919, 2021, and the biggest silent film star, the comedian we have. But he's no more. And most of his movies are silent, but not all. And Charlie Chaplin is no more. The tramps long laid to rest. and nothing is that was before his sun set in the west. He made us laugh. He made the poor with every new release what audiences rooted for, and now he rests in peace. And silent in the video store, collected in a box beyond the action and the gore on the shelf that never talks. The speechless hobo, though inept, was feisty in his fight, but no one takes him home except the very erudite. Still fewer know the silent heart, nor wail for waifs or masses. Those predisposed to take his part dozed at their film classes. The city's like a ghetto now, walled in by a giant screen that only shows what dawns allow from layers unknown, unseen. Elders who once climbed the height and saw the west have said that the endless road's now endless night, and Charlie Chaplin's dead. But I, refusing to forget or to believe, protest by buying an entire boxed set of the tramp who headed west. And though I know his hopeful sun shone only in black and white, I flip them through and pick out one as silent as tonight, about the clown who had no name, and now in silence load to see the sun in the final frame set on an open road. And you can see the sunlight on the cover of Stage to Page 2. It's actually Saturn. It's a diver in front of a moon of Saturn's. And if you ever saw The Simpsons, about 3 or 4 episodes of The Simpsons have Bart and Homer headed west with the sun setting, but it comes right from the end of several Charlie Chaplin movies where, within The Champ, he ends that way, with Pollock Goddard once they're headed west, back to the horizon, the camera's behind them, and there they go off somewhere else for a better future, with all their travails.
Better life, right,
yeah.
Exactly.
So even that comedy was about something. It was about, besides creating your own chaos, controlling your own chaos, or undermining the authority figures, which is sort of what the Marx Brothers was about too.
Yes.
There was an anarchistic comedy that was actually thwarting authority, so to combat bully culture. And so even that we need, again, something to combat the bully culture on the
and of course then Chaplin went on to do The Dictator, which couldn't
The
be
Great Dictator.
which couldn't be more appropriate than
At that time, right.
And now.
It was banned in Germany forever.
Yeah.
And very, oh my gosh. And then won his 2 Oscars in 1970 for Limelight. 2 Oscars, one for composing music, and was it the other one for the script, I think, anyway. But he finally won 2 Oscars in 1970. Because in the 20s, in silent movies, it was before the Oscars were around.
Yes.
Right. So
when you're so when I'm writing my stuff, I have dialogue. So I actually read the dialogue. First, I think about it in my head.
Right.
Oftentimes, when I'm doing things like on an exercise machine or riding a bicycle, a real bicycle.
Yeah.
So I write. So I read. So I create the dialogue, and I hear it in my head, and then I speak it out loud to no one, just to keep, because it's supposed to be spoken dialogue. So I keep on doing, and I'm sure playwrights must do this. But as a poet, do you speak out loud?
Absolutely.
To no one in particular.
And people in particular.
Okay.
Oh yeah, a lot of people come to my house to hear poetry.
Oh. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We have lots of books, and on Saturday nights they're usually on the floor with people around them.
Oh, okay.
I don't have television reception, although I have videos on the TV. But we take books off because the way my apartment is set up, you can't help but look at the vinyl and the books and just go, take one off, and that's what you're there for.
Oh,
all right. To find something and share it.
Okay.
Like Howard Nemeroff or Robert Francis. Robert Francis, I have on vinyl too. Somebody gave me as a gift because they were at my house and knew I loved Robert Francis and didn't know any. They found that online, so I have him reading his own poetry.
That's
darn good.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't ask for it, but it's a surprise.
Right.
So,
so you have your own literary salons in your house on a regular basis.
Irregular basis. Irregular basis, yeah, a lot. And then I have a writers collective at our local branch of our library too, twice a month. And then I go to workshops in New England anytime, Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Connecticut, anywhere where a library or a group has a workshop to either share poems or workshop them, sometimes for feedback. And when I was taking care of my mom, as I was her caregiver for a few years, and even before then, I'd read everything to her, and if she could get it, and sometimes even knew the last word, even if it was not a highly predictable word, I knew she was with me, and I knew the through line of the poem was able to be followed. So I want to bring her along, and which is not too far away from an attentive audience person at a poetry reading.
Wow.
I try to bring them along. Don't do it in front of, do it with. But that's the same principle as playing the audience. Don't do it in front of the audience, do it with the audience. Don't let the audience know you're doing that, perhaps, how you're bringing them along. Don't let your craft show that you're bringing them along. But that's what I believe poetry can be, is taking the audience along with you to a place they've never been before, in the safety of their homes or their chairs or whatnot. So I love that. The transformative and the transportive in two ways, right? Transportive a la metaphysical, and transportive is take you somewhere else. Literally.
Do you, as a writer, as a poet, do you see yourself as having evolved? I mean, how old were you when you wrote your first poem, for example?
Second grade, published.
Second grade.
A zoo is a zoo, and it's for you, and it's for Worcester too. I'd like a zoo one nice and new, and I would even like two. Elephants are big, something was strong. Giraffes are big and something or other, and Worcester should have a zoo. Now, I don't know the third and fourth stanza by heart, but I wrote a novel in kindergarten, and a novel in first grade, and then poem published in second grade in the paper, and then an editorial in fifth grade. Fifth grade field trip to the Cape Cod National Seashore. Let's save the marshes. I wrote about it, fifth grade. I was in love with nature, and they published my editorial when I was in fifth grade. And so that was my early stuff. But I turned into a math and music geek, and then just a music geek and whatnot. Not and comic books was my big thing, grades 4 through 12, whatever, 11. Or something. So I was big on comic books, but not literature. And then I got turned on to literature, reading Thomas Hardy after coming back from Thomas Hardy Country in England. You haven't read Thomas Hardy yet? I'd already graduated from college. No, I haven't read Thomas Hardy. What did he write? And then I read the opening chapter of Return of the Native and realized, oh, that's writing. And I spent a whole day rereading it and calling up friends on the phone and reading them parts of it. Couldn't believe that his description of the moor, and this is where Pym was, and this is where Eustacia Vi is. I hope I have their names right. And the moor between, and I couldn't get to chapter 2. I still remember that day, and friends of mine remember that day. That's when I started to get turned on to real literature, and that was age 23-ish, a year or two after college. Yeah. So it's not that I lost time. I did have teachers that were very much turned on by Robinson Jeffers or some great stuff, so that enthusiasm I remembered and things. But then to find your own, whoa, this poet really turns me on, wow, is fabulous. To come across something in a journal and go, as Emily Dickinson said, have your head knocked off. Then you know it's poetry. And I love when that happens. And it's rare, but not never.
Right,
it's not never. I keep a spreadsheet type of thing. Really, it's just a list, a table list in Word. It's not actually an Excel or whatever spreadsheet, but listing all my favorite poems. And 238 of them are Emily Dickinson's, but over 100 are Cummings. So they're my two. Again, and interestingly enough, they are the metaphysical poets that go back to John Donne and Marvell and Philip Sidney and all those English Renaissance metaphysical poets. So those are the two great, and Robert Frost and Whitman are sometimes lumped with the metaphysical poets. So I love that when they're really through the Emily Dickinson is as large as the universe, or through the blade of grass is as large as God. And through the blade of grass, he sees God and knows God and doesn't need any other proof of God. So there's a metaphysical, magical thing happening in just the way they look at the world. That just gives me a rush. And John Donne, same. A little thicker John Donne, so you got to read him a few times. But I must say, I don't get all of Cummings, and I don't get all of Dickinson either. Some of them, there's a good third of those poems I go, what the? But then the ones you get, you go, oh my gosh, brilliant, wow, knock my head off. So I love that.
But do we get a sense that modern education has no appreciation for some of these older poets and
I don't know, but I don't know. A lot of kids get some poetry, and I do workshops where kids have had some kind of poetry, But even people getting MFAs in poetry or creative writing in poetry, they do exercises to get something on the page, but when I grew up in the 70s was the tail end of the peace movement that was going to win, but although it didn't. So when I was a freshman at Clark University, the first week they go out to New Hampshire, the seniors that I had already met in the first 2 weeks because I worked in the dining hall and whatnot. James, get on the bus, we're going to Seabrook. What's Seabrook? Well, we got a protest. Oh, okay. Well, I have class now. You all got a bag. You planned it. They were seniors. They'd been saving the world for 3 years. And they were all on TV arrested that night. I was so proud of them. And I go, oh, that's Seabrook. I would never forget. That was fall of 76, September, a week after Labor Day. That kind of caring is the opposite of what education's trying to do. They're making everyone terrified from filling in dots and getting scores. And so people are not, in many public schools, what's happened are there's no, show and tell is out. So whatever you need to do when you go in front of a judge or a town meeting or whatever to speak, you've at least had show and tell for X number of years and you've gotten in front of a group to speak about something. Now people are more and more terrified of that because they didn't get 12 years of experience doing show and tell. Or however many, maybe it didn't happen in high school, but by then you had oral reports of something.
Right.
So you start even in first grade, bring something that happened and show us. And so you can speak without worrying about having a poem memorized or something memorized or doing wrong. All you're doing is talking to everybody about something that happened or something you want to bring in and talking. That's out. In many schools, there's no getting up because it's not testable. So the important thing for an American to get is speaking, listening, reading, writing, and communicating with understanding.
Right.
And a lot of that, it's just how do you fill in the dots well. A lot of teachers are terrified by from the administration from the politicians, and it should be the other way around. It should be the teachers telling the administration what they need, and administration telling the government what they need. The government shouldn't be telling anybody else. It's all backward, and teachers know that. Every teacher that sixth grade have been, they don't get grammar at all. Those teachers want to teach grammar, can teach grammar. I said, what do? Well, you have to say things like, how much better it would be if you knew the grammar, and try to turn the kid on into learning grammar himself. Well, we had grammar. We had parts of speech. You have MFAs that don't know parts of speech or the objective case of a pronoun. But without proper grammar, how do you think clearly and how do you inspire? How do you get Winston Churchill to give his lovely speech, the darkest hour is about? How do you get Abraham Lincoln? Of course, he was self-educated a lot too, to write the Gettysburg Address and make the North on the right side.
Right.
He made a government of the people, by the people, for the people. No one had said that before at all because he had grammar. And that was number one most important thing in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance of a university. So education is doing what? The other fear that we have is not being able to have a job.
Right.
So it's turning into trade school. That's great, but for a democratic population that's the king, that's sovereign, you need them to be able to rule. You need everybody knowing enough that we can be our own masters. It takes a little bit more than how to rivet something or how to do game theory. You need a little more citizenry. And then the other thing that's happened in 30 years, young people don't even know the word civics. Now, when I was in high school, we didn't have a class called civics, but my brother's 3 years older, they had civics, as well as history and social studies.
How to be a citizen.
Right, how to be a citizen. They don't even, the word doesn't exist in education, virtually, at least public. So it's like, wow, no wonder what's happening is happening. The Lord High Chancellor is taking everything away from the king and the queen. We're the king and the queen. The Lord High Chancellor is running everything. Just like Richelieu or Rochambeau or who's the Russian guy, Rasputin, to take the power away from the ruler. Then it was a king or a queen or a czar or whatnot. But if the ruler is the people, power has been taken away by the administrators. It's very interesting.
It is.
And poetry can address that.
Yes.
Come on, people. Not just truth to power, but what's going on. And so very few people in writing programs are inspired or even suggested care. The number one thing that writing can and should come about is caring. And you talk a lot about caring in your writing, particularly the Soviet socialist paradigm or the whatever. We have to fight fascism.
Right.
It's been going on for thousands of years, not
well,
just
the thing, of course, about some of my books, because it is taking these characters come out of the Soviet Union, is the ability to hear words that you know are not true. that's certainly part of the logic of which we're missing in terms of educating people to listen to something, and it makes absolute no sense.
Right.
And that you have to say, wait a minute, it doesn't make any sense. This is Orwellian. Of course, I hope more people are at least getting to read 1984.
Oh my gosh! And not only did he have as one of the principles, I mean, this is what I say now, and I was inspired by rereading 1984, which we had for our book group in New York, so I reread 1984. Ignorance is strength. Well, ignorance is not strength, and meanness is not patriotism, and intolerance is not faith. These things aren't, they are the opposite. Intolerance is actually the opposite of Christianity, of what Christ's message was, no, it's treating people from the other tribe like your own. That's why the guy came, to say what he had to say. The Old Testament Ten Commandments weren't enough. And so people calling, even in the 80s, speaking of the Soviet Union, not a card-carrying socialist at all was I, but calling things what they are, yelling at the radio all the time when they would call the Soviet Union socialist. There's not socialist, right. It's dictatorship, it's totalitarian. Right. We don't have the United States is a democracy, or a democracy in progress, should not have problem with this socialism. They're both two kinds of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Our complaint, and the story should have been told this way with Chinese and Russian or Cuban, whatnot, socialism/communism, was that they were totalitarian. They were not socialist.
It was Orwell, of course, as I understand Orwell's 1984, in fact, it's a case against the Soviet Union. And its idea of learning from the Nazis about taking words and changing their meaning and saying it over, like Himmler or Goebbels, saying it over and over and over again until the lie becomes the truth, because you no longer know what the truth is.
Right, or you create a wave of people behaving as if that's the alternate the alternate way to behave, and we must fight that. We must, yes, etc. So that's what the education system should be addressing. It's the biggest danger in the world, because I still believe the United States is the greatest experiment. But even that, we have the poll tax in this country. This is getting off, but it's about carrying stuff, and it's not to say that I always write about this, but why didn't we call the United States a democracy in progress? We didn't even elect senators till the 1900s.
Right.
And most people could not vote. Poor people couldn't vote in 5 states till the 1960s after the poll tax amendment. You couldn't call it a democracy in progress, or a working toward a democracy. Why do we have to say we're defending democracy? We don't have democracy. We are working toward democracy, or having democracy on paper. That's not too hard a concept for a fifth grader. Because I know in fifth grade my hand went up and said, what do you mean Columbus discovered America? There were people here. So we're told, what do we have this holiday for? Now I found out why we have it, but he didn't discover, there were Americans here. He discovered Americans, and he didn't call them Americans yet. So the appropriate identification of, wait, that's nonsense, that's what makes a good American, is the appropriate middle finger extended, the appropriate use of that. And that's why Emerson and Thoreau are so important, how to protest civil disobedience. Wait a second, y'all. Y'all are doing the wrong thing here. You got to speak up, make your country right when that happens. So, what poetry can help to do is help you, anyone, even in a non-political situation, look at something for what it is, or look at something in a new way by turning the prism to a new facet or aspect of a situation. I'll read you a slightly interesting poem that actually took place. It's a true story of what happened my very first day in Europe. I get into Paris before the morning, and it's called, boy, I don't remember what it's called, but I know what the picture is. So if I look in the back for the
illustration,
it's of the but what happened was, when I got there, it's with cathedrals, right? It's about the Notre Dame. There was somebody threatening to jump from one of the towers my very first morning. Okay, that's earlier than the cathedrals. So I think it's in my cathedral section. Oh my goodness.
They were going to jump from the Cathedral of Notre Dame?
Yep. Oh. Yeah, and it was my very first morning in Europe. Here we are.
For the very first time?
For the very first time. Broke. It must, yeah.
Can I ask what year it was?
Yes, 1981.
1981. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Here we go. Jump.
It's short because we're going.
Oh, if we're going, it's a little too long.
Okay.
But anyway,
All
so there's a
right.
poem in Out of Nothing called Jump. It was going to be a long one. I can read a shorter one if you wish. But we could just talk for a little bit.
Okay.
That's all right, too.
Well, what I was going to do is I'm going to put my promos for
wonderful.
Literary Salon.
Coming up in West
Oh,
and the
yes,
area.
Literary
Wonderful.
Salon. You have been a guest of mine on Literary Salon twice. Hopefully you'll come back again.
Wonderful.
And I want to, I have to give a shout out because Literary Salon would not exist. One, of course, I'm the organizer, so tap me on the shoulder. But more importantly, I found two businesses that were willing to be vendors for me, to be the venue without any hesitation, without restrictions. So I have to give a shout out to Colin Bennett, the owner of the Malted Barley in downtown Westerly. Not only does he do craft beer and these incredible sandwiches made out of pretzels, but he also gives an opportunity for local authors to be heard. And we go to the Literary Salon, Books and Brews, cute little name, at the Malted Barley, fourth Tuesday of the month. So the fourth Tuesday of the month, I hope you'll come by. 7 o'clock, all my events start at 7. So that lets you either have an early dinner or after you've gone, you can have a late dinner. And because downtown Westerly has evolved into this kind of culinary, literary place, you can find a place to eat at 9 o'clock. There's plenty of restaurants. So that's what we do at the Malted Barley. Then I want to give out a shout out to Adam Mercer, the co-owner of the Tapped Apple, which produces hard cider and apple wine. Again, downtown Westerly. He's on 37 High Street. I want to shout out to him because Adam is not only giving us a space on the third Wednesdays of each month for mostly authors of one kind or another, but also on the first Wednesdays of each month we're having the Poetry Corner. So we have all these wonderful poets. And unlike novelists, I would say poets come in much more variety that I've personally seen. So we have an opportunity for people who are not published, who will probably never be published, but it's an opportunity for them to hear what an audience says in terms of reaction to a poet. So I think that's a great opportunity. So I want to give those shout outs. The third Wednesday at the Tapped Apple, this coming August 15th, at 7 o'clock, I, Harriet Grayson, otherwise known as the novelist Anastasia Goodman, will be doing a book launch for my newest book, The Terrorist. So that's an opportunity for you to hear me talk about my books and about mysteries. And my character is a Russian-born New York City police detective, so we get a little bit of Russian history. President Putin actually is a minor character in my first novel, Loose Ends. So I want to give a shout out to these people because Literary Salon would not exist if it wasn't for Adam Mercer and Colin Bennett. So I want to thank them. And I also now want to thank you, James, for coming. He comes as far as New York City.
New York City, where I'm headed tonight. But
Yes.
first I go to a salon in Westerly this evening.
Yes,
Right.
yes. So I'm very happy that you were my guest twice. I hope to see you many more times.
Wonderful.
You're a wonderful entertainer.
Thank you, Harriet.
So that's
much.
the way, that makes poetry, and even you don't have novels, but you have hopefully plays that you've written maybe that you want to
Plays, yep.
put on
A
in
few
literary.
produced but not published, right?
Yep, put on in Literary Salon. We would
Right.
love to see that. We did have one playwright come and do a modification of his play. Love the opportunity to hear plays. So,
Wonderful.
thank you, James. Thank you, my audience. Hopefully you're suffering lightly from this heat. This is Harriet Grayson, your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase.